Hello, my dear adventurers. It's Max. Welcome back to another quiet evening of shared tales and hidden journeys. Tonight we're not just wandering through the woods or following paths across the open plains. No, tonight we're going deeper, much deeper, down under the earth itself, all the way into the darkened mines of Moria, once a kingdom of glory, now a place of ruin. For me, there are so many iconic moments in The Lord of the Rings. You could pick Rivendell, or the Ride of the Rohirrim, or the Fires of Mount Doom, but if I had to choose a single sequence that has shaped how I think of fantasy itself, it would be the Fellowship entering the mines of Moria. That journey, that slow march into darkness, the shadows of ages gone by, and of course, the terrible confrontation between Gandalf and the Balrogs. Few stories feel as old, as heavy, as inevitable as that one. So tonight, we'll do something a little different. We'll begin with a deep dive into the history of Moria, into the dwarves who lived there, into the origins of the Balrogs, and how all these pieces connect. After that, we'll move into one of my favorite chapters from the Fellowship of the Ring, when the company chooses the path beneath the mountain to escape Sauron's spies. And then? Well, then we'll follow where the echoes of stone lead us. Get cozy, pour yourself a mug of dwarven ale, wrap up warm against the chill, and let's step together into the ancient dark. Long before the name Moria was whispered with dread, the place had another name, Khazad-dûm. It was no mine in those days, but the crown jewel of dwarven craftsmanship, the shining heart of their civilization, their pride, their home. And if we want to understand how all of this began, we must go back to the very first roots of dwarven history. Back to the figure they called Durin the Deathless. Durin was the eldest of the 7 dwarven fathers, and unlike the rest, he did not truly die. Not really. The dwarves believed that his spirit returned again and again in his descendants. Each time a new Durin was born, they said, it was the same soul returning to lead his people. A single spirit that never left, but always watched, always guided. He awoke first at Mount Gundabad, a lonely peak far to the north. From there, Durin journeyed south until he came to a glen of shadows between 2 vast arms of the mountains. Above him shone 3 great white peaks, and below lay a small, quiet lake. This lake reflected the stars with such clarity that it seemed like a second sky. When Durin gazed into those waters, he saw above his head a crown of stars. He took this as a sign, a destiny. He named the lake Coldsurum, the Miramir, and the 3 peaks he called Berizanbar, Zarek Sigil, and Bundu Shother, the Red Horn, the Silverteen, and Cloudy Head. Durin chose the caves above the lake as the seat of his new kingdom. His descendants raised a monolith, Durin's Stone, carved with runes, standing where he had first looked into the Miramir. To the dwarves this was sacred ground, their heart, their soul. Durin set his people to work, carving the stone of the mountains into vast halls and endless passages. What they built was no mere stronghold. It was an empire, a wonder of the world. Khazad-dûm grew swiftly in size and splendor, until it was famed as the greatest of all dwarven mansions. Its beauty was unmatched. Endless pillars carved like living trees, bridges spanning bottomless chasms, walls etched with runes of pride and memory. But it was not just beauty. Khazad-dûm was strong. Its walls were thicker than castle keeps, its passages winding and labyrinthine enough to confuse even the wisest elf. Its forges rang day and night with the song of hammer and anvil. And yet, below those glorious chambers lay older places, primordial tunnels, everlasting darkness. there nameless things dwelled, creatures from before the shaping of the world. Few had ever seen them, and fewer still had returned. Gandalf himself would later wonder if the Watcher in the Water, that monstrous tentacled horror outside Moria's west gate, was one of those beings. But for all the mystery and danger hidden in the dark, it was not those things that brought Khazad-dûm its greatest fame. It was the ore buried deep within its bones. Not gold, not silver, but mithril. The elves called it true silver, stronger than steel, yet lighter than silk, a treasure worth more than kingdoms. It never tarnished, never rusted. Its sheen was like moonlight trapped in metal. A single thread of mithril was said to be worth more than a chest of gold. And with this, Khazad-dûm became the envy of the world. But even the richest kingdoms need more than wealth to survive. They need allies, trade, peace with neighbors. For the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, those neighbors were the elves of Origin. And for a time, a miracle happened. Dwarves and elves, who so often mistrusted one another, set aside their differences. They formed a partnership. The elves needed mithril and dwarven craftsmanship. The dwarves welcomed the elves' enchantments and knowledge. Together they entered into a golden age. One of the finest examples of their cooperation was the doors of Durin, set into the rock face of the misty mountains. When shut, the doors were seamless, invisible, as if the mountain itself were whole. But under moonlight, elvish letters shimmered into view, glowing with a soft blue light. Speak, friend, and enter. The design was a collaboration. Narvi, the dwarf, built the frame and mechanism. Celebrimbor, the elf, wove enchantment into the stone. Together, they created a wonder, a symbol of peace between two peoples. But peace in Middle-earth never lasts forever. A stranger came to the elves, a figure calling himself Anatar. He offered wisdom, knowledge, the promise of greater craft. But Anatar was no friend. He was Sauron in disguise. With his help, the elves forged the rings of power. And we all know how that ended. When the truth was revealed, it was too late. Sauron unleashed his wrath upon Eregion. Cities burned. Celebrimbor was slain. The rings were scattered, hidden, or seized. Among them were those given to the dwarves. And here lies a strange truth. The dwarves could not be bent to Sauron's will, but the rings twisted them in subtler ways. They amplified greed. Desire for wealth became obsession. Ambition turned to ruin. After Eregion's fall, Khazad-dûm shut its doors. No one entered, no one left. The Golden Age was over. Elves and dwarves grew estranged. By the time Gimli and Legolas stood together on the shores of Rivendell, they carried the bitterness of 1,000 years of mistrust. Still, Khazad-dûm endured. The forges burned. The mining continued. And under the influence of the rings, their hunger for mithril grew. Deeper they dug, always deeper, and in their desire, they forgot the old warnings. He who digs for treasure should beware of what lies beneath. It began slowly. Strange noises in the lowest tunnels, small tremors that made lanterns sway, whispers among the miners of shadows moving where no shadows should be. At first, they dismissed it. Dwarves are the folk of stone. What danger could shadows hold for them? But superstition gave way to terror the day Durin Vi, king of Khazad-dûm, was slain. He had awoken something vast, something terrible, a creature of fire and shadow, the Balrog, Durin's bane. It slaughtered all who stood against it. The king, his son, every warrior who faced it. Their bodies were blackened, scorched, as though a forge had exploded. The dwarves realized, too late, what they had done. In their greed, They had broken into a place older than their kingdom, older than the elves. They had awakened a servant of Morgoth himself. The dwarves fled. Khazad-dûm was abandoned, and from then on it bore a new name, Moria, the Black Pit. I'll pause here, because before we can continue with the story of Moria's fall, we need to understand what a Balrog truly is. Most picture the scene from the film's horns, fire, whip of flame, a monster. But Balrogs are not beasts. They are not like trolls or orcs. They are Maiar spirits, the same order of being as Gandalf, as Saruman. Long before the shaping of the world, these spirits served the Valar, the greater powers. The shapers of Arda, above them all, was Ilúvatar, the one who created all things. The Valar brought forth beauty and balance. The Maiar aided them. But among the Valar was one who rebelled, Melkor, later known as Morgoth. He desired not harmony, but dominion, not beauty, but control. He swayed many Maiar to his side, Sauron, and the Balrogs. Once their flame was pure, a symbol of creation, but under Morgoth it became a weapon, a tool of destruction. Their forms grew physical, terrible, shadows wreathed in fire, hearts of flame, tongues like blades, eyes like furnaces. Few could stand against them. On the battlefield, to see a Balrog was to know despair. That is where we will leave this first part, standing at the edge of fire and shadow. Next time we'll descend deeper into their history, their battles, and how the echoes of Morgoth reached into the Third Age to shape the fate of Khazad-dûm. So rest easy, adventurers, and prepare for what waits in the dark. We ended last time at the edge of flame and shadow, with the revelation that the Balrogs were not mere monsters, but fallen spirits Maiar, the same order of being as Gandalf himself. And to understand what it meant for one of these beings to rise again in the depths of Khazad-dûm, we must go deeper into their origin. The world before the First Age was not yet shaped. It was music, the song of Ilúvatar, the creator above all. He set forth themes, and the Valar, his great powers, wove them into harmony. With them were the Maiar, lesser spirits, who aided in the weaving of this cosmic symphony. But among them was one who refused to remain in harmony. Melkor, his heart was filled with pride and a hunger for dominion. His voice rose against the others, bringing discord into the music. Later, he would be known as Morgoth, the first Dark Lord. Some of the Maiar listened to him. They were drawn to his fire, to his promise of power and control. Among those who bent their knee to him were the Balrogs. Once, their fire had been light, a flame of creation. Under Morgoth, that fire was darkened, twisted. Their forms took on shape, towering figures, shadows clad in flame. They carried whips of fire, maces of burning iron, and their very presence struck terror before them. The exact number of Balrogs is uncertain. Some stories say there were only a few, perhaps as few as 3. Others whisper there were many as 7 or more. But whatever the number, each was a terror in its own right. Now, before we return to Moria, there is another tale to tell. A tale that reveals just how vast and terrible the darkness of Morgoth could be. It is the story of Ungoliant. Ungoliant was not a Balrog. She was something else entirely, a being of pure shadow and hunger. Her origin is one of the great mysteries of Tolkien's legendarium. Some say she came from beyond Arda, from the void itself, that place outside creation where even the Valar did not go. Others whisper that she too was once a Maya, like the Balrogs, but twisted, warped into a monstrous form. Whatever the truth, her hunger was her defining trait. She devoured light, leaving only darkness behind. Ungoliant took the shape of a monstrous spider. vast, horrific, and her hunger was insatiable. Morgoth, in his rebellion against the Valar, sought her aid. He promised her a reward beyond imagining. If she helped him, he would feed her hunger. She agreed, and together they struck one of the darkest blows in all of Arda's history. In the blessed realm of Valinor stood the two trees, Telperion and Laurelin. They were the source of light for all the world, silver and gold, sunlight and moonlight combined. Their glow was life itself. Morgoth came to them with a spear and struck. But the trees were not destroyed, not yet. Their light still shone. That was when Ungoliant crept forward. She sank her fangs into the trees and drained them dry. Their sap, their light, their very essence. Into herself she pulled it all, until the trees withered and died. And in that moment, the world was plunged into darkness. Ungoliant swelled with every drop of light she consumed. She grew so vast, so terrible, that even Morgoth feared her. He had unleashed something he could not control. After they fled together to Middle-earth, she demanded more. Morgoth gave her jewels from his hoard, treasures he had stolen from the elves. She devoured them greedily. But when she asked for the Silmarils, Morgoth refused. Those jewels he would never surrender. In her fury, Ungoliant attacked him. She spun her webs around him, choking him, binding him in a cocoon of gloom. Morgoth, the first Dark Lord, screamed in agony. His cry was so terrible that it echoed through the world. And the Balrogs, sleeping in their pits beneath his fortress of Angband, heard him. They woke, and they came. Whips of fire in their hands, they tore through Ungoliant's webs. They struck at her shadow, forcing her to retreat. Even she, vast as she had become, could not withstand them. She fled, vanishing into the forgotten corners of the world. From her line would come many of the monstrous spiders that haunted Middle-earth, including Shelob, who would one day lurk in Cirith Ungol. And so we see that even Morgoth, the mightiest of the Valar, relied on his Balrogs as his saviors. Such was their strength. The Balrogs became Morgoth's captains, his champions. On the battlefields of the First Age, their appearance meant doom. Few dared to face them, and fewer still survived. One of the most infamous of all Balrogs was Gothmog, their lord. He fought at the battle under the stars, where he struck down Fëanor, the greatest of the elves. Fëanor had pursued Morgoth's forces after the theft of the Silmarils, driven by fury. But when Gothmog came against him, his fire was quenched. Fëanor's wounds were mortal, and his sons carried him from the field. Gothmog's name would be cursed forever among the elves, and his terror did not end there. When Morgoth finally learned of Gondolin, the hidden city of the elves, he threw everything he had at it. Dragons, orcs, and among them, the Balrogs. Gothmog himself led the charge. Riding on the back of a dragon, he stormed the city. There he faced Ecthelion of the Fountain, one of Gondolin's great captains. Their battle was fierce. Ecthelion drove the spike of his helm into Gothmog's chest, and together they fell into the Fountain of the King. The waters extinguished Gothmog's flame, and both were slain. It was rare, almost unheard of, for a Balrog to be killed, but it could be done, at terrible cost. At the end of the First Age came the War of Wrath. The Valar themselves, at last, came to Middle-earth to break Morgoth once and for all. Their hosts clashed with his in battles so vast that the very shape of the land was changed. Mountains fell, seas rose, and in the end, Morgoth was defeated. Bound in chains, he was cast into the void. Many of his servants perished, his armies scattered, his fortresses destroyed. and the Balrogs most were slain, but not all. Some fled. They sank into the deepest, darkest places of the world, hidden, waiting. And so it was that, thousands of years later, in the year 1980 of the Third Age, the dwarves of Khazad-dûm dug too deep, and one of those hidden Balrogs was awakened, Durin's Bane. When the dwarves fled Khazad-dûm, the Balrog did not remain alone. His very presence drew other creatures of darkness, orcs, goblins, cave. They crept up from the cracks, taking over the upper halls. They built nests in the ruins, always careful never to venture too far down. Even they feared the Balrog, but not all dwarves were willing to give up their home. Centuries later, Balin, one of Thorin Oakenshield's companions on the quest for Erebor, led an expedition to reclaim Moria. He remembered how Erebor had been won back from Smaug, and thought the same could be done with Khazad-dûm. He and his kin entered the Black Pit. At first, their news was hopeful. They found Mithril again. They held the upper halls. Balin was hailed as Lord of Moria. Letters sent to Erebor spoke of triumph. But darkness gathers quickly in the deeps. The orcs of Moria grew bolder. The goblins attacked in greater numbers. Balin himself was slain, shot by an orc arrow near the Mirror. His companions fought on, but they were overwhelmed. Their last stand was in the chamber of Mizarbal, where their tombs and broken shields lay. It was there, years later, that Gimli would weep for his cousin. When the Fellowship came to Moria, it was not their first choice. Far from it. They had tried the Redhorn Pass, but the snows were merciless, and the mountain itself seemed to resist them. Spies of Sauron, cruel birds called Creebane, filled the skies. To remain in the open was death. There was only one way left, the way under the mountain. Even Gimli was uncertain. He believed perhaps Balin had reclaimed the halls, that Moria might yet be safe. But Boromir was uneasy. Legolas wanted no part of it. Gandalf himself was reluctant. But in the end, the decision was made. They came to the west gate built into the mountain's face. By day, it seemed a blank wall of unbroken stone. But under moonlight, its design revealed itself. A hammer and anvil for dwarven craft. A crown and 7 stars for Durin, and the elvish inscription, the doors of Durin, Lord of Moria. Speak, friend, and enter. It seemed a riddle, an invitation. Gandalf tried many words of power, thinking the key must be some secret phrase. But the answer was simple. Frodo suggested the words be taken literally. Gandalf spoke the elvish word for friend, Melon. The doors opened. The path into darkness lay revealed. But as the doors opened, the still waters of the nearby pool rippled. Something stirred beneath, something ancient. Tentacles broke the surface. The Watcher in the water seized Frodo, dragging him toward the depths. The company fought, hacking at the limbs. More tentacles rose. The creature's full form was never seen. Perhaps it was one of those nameless things Gandalf had spoken of. Perhaps older still. Whatever it was dreadful. They fought it off, but the Watcher slammed the gates shut behind them. The Fellowship was sealed inside Moria. There would be no turning back. That is where we will pause this second part, with the Fellowship's first steps into the Black Pit, and the shadows of Durin's Bane waiting in the depths. Rest well, adventurers. For next time, we will walk the darkened halls, and see the doom that awaited Gandalf upon the bridge of Khazad-dûm. The doors of Durin were shut behind them, the Watcher in the water having dragged the stone closed, leaving the Fellowship no choice but to descend into the ancient dark. There was no turning back now. Only the black halls of Khazad-dûm lay before them, and whatever waited in the depths. The first thing that struck them was the silence. A silence so deep it pressed against the ears, broken only by the echoes of their own footsteps. Gandalf lit his staff, and a faint glow spread across the stone. Dwarven craftsmanship surrounded them, smooth walls, wide passages, and archways carved with precision. But there was no sound of hammers, no voices of dwarves, only stillness. As they moved forward, the air grew stale. Dust lay thick upon the ground. Here and there, broken weapons, shattered shields, the traces of old battles long since ended. Moria was no bustling kingdom, it was a tomb. They walked for hours, the path winding deeper into the mountain. Gimli's eyes glimmered with pride as he looked upon the work of his ancestors, though sorrow shadowed his face. Frodo felt a heaviness pressing on his heart. Even the hobbits, who had little knowledge of dwarves and their ways, sensed the weight of the place. At last they reached a great hall. Pillars rose on either side, massive, like the trunks of stone trees. Gandalf's light revealed only part of it, but even so, the space seemed endless. The hobbits stared in awe. Never had they seen such vastness underground, and yet, the grandeur could not mask the emptiness. Moria was dead. They camped that night in the dark, and Gandalf allowed them to rest. But he did not sleep. His thoughts turned often to the dangers that might lurk ahead. He knew well that this road was perilous, but he hoped to find Balin, or at least some sign of him, before despair set in. As they pressed on, Gandalf led them with confidence. He had walked these halls before, though not for many years. Still, there were moments of doubt. Corridors stretched into darkness, stairways descended into black chasms, and the weight of the mountain seemed to press upon them all. At times, Gandalf paused, uncertain which way to take. He would stand still, muttering to himself, trying to recall the old paths. The Fellowship watched in silence, knowing their fate rested on his memory. On the fourth day, they came upon a doorway. Inside was a chamber. Tables were overturned, weapons scattered, and at the center, a tomb. Carved upon the stone were words in runes. Gimli stepped forward, his voice shaking as he read. Here lies Balin, son of Fundin, Lord of Moria. The hope of finding Balin alive vanished in an instant. Gimli bowed his head in grief. The hobbits stood silently, their hearts heavy for their friend. Even Boromir looked solemn, the weight of failure heavy upon them all. Upon the stone lay an open book, worn and damaged by fire and water. Gandalf lifted it carefully. The pages were torn, the writing smudged, but enough remained to tell the tale. He read aloud, "We drove out the orcs from the great gate. Balin has set up his seat in the chamber of Mizarbal, found Mithril. We have taken the upper halls." At first, the words spoke of triumph, but as Gandalf turned the pages, the tale darkened. Mentions of shadows in the deep, of drums, of fear spreading among the dwarves. The final entries were broken, hurried, scrawled in desperation. "We cannot get out. They are coming. Drums, drums in the deep. We cannot get out." Gandalf closed the book. The chamber was silent. Then the silence broke, a faint sound. The distant thud of a drum. Doom, doom, doom. The Fellowship froze. The drums grew louder. Orc voices echoed in the darkness, harsh and cruel. Arrows clattered against the stone. From the shadows, goblins poured forth, their eyes glinting with malice. The battle of the Chamber of Mizarbal had begun. Aragorn and Boromir stood at the door, their swords flashing. Legolas loosed arrow after arrow, each finding its mark. Gimli roared, his axe biting deep. Even the hobbits fought, their small blades striking where they could. Gandalf himself raised his staff, casting light into the chamber, blinding their foes. The goblins pressed hard, but the Fellowship held their ground. Then came a sound that chilled them all. A deep roar. The ground shook. A cave troll lumbered into the chamber, its massive bulk squeezing through the doorway. Its hide was thick, its strength terrible. With a roar, it swung its club, smashing the stone, scattering the defenders. The Fellowship fought desperately. Arrows bounced off its hide. Blades struck, but did little. The troll's rage was unstoppable. It seized Frodo, lifting him into the air. With a thrust, it drove its spear into the hobbit's chest. Frodo cried out and fell. The Fellowship's hearts nearly stopped. But Frodo stirred. He lived. Beneath his shirt, hidden until that moment, was the mithril coat Bilbo had given him. The spear had struck true, but mithril had turned it aside. The price of that little shirt could have bought all the wealth of the Shire 1,000 times over, and in that moment it saved Frodo's life. The troll bellowed, but Legolas was swift. He leaped upon the creature's back, his knife striking deep into its neck. With a final cry, the cave troll fell, crashing to the floor. The goblins faltered, but only for a moment. More pressed in. Gandalf called for retreat. The Fellowship burst from the chamber, fleeing into the dark halls. Behind them, the drums thundered. Doom, doom, doom. The chase through Moria was a blur of fear and flame. Orcs swarmed the corridors. Arrows whistled past. Boromir and Aragorn cut down foes left and right. The hobbits ran as fast as their legs could carry them. Gandalf led them on, his staff blazing with light. But the orcs were relentless. Then, suddenly, they stopped. The goblins shrieked in terror, turning from the chase. They scattered, fleeing into the shadows. The drums fell silent. The Fellowship halted, confused. Why had their enemies abandoned the hunt? Then they heard it. A sound that was not drums. A sound deeper, heavier, like fire breathing, like stone cracking. A roar that seemed to come from the mountain itself. Flame, shadow, a terror of the ancient world. Durin's bane had awoken. The Fellowship fled down the great hall of Khazad-dûm. Gandalf urged them on, his voice grim. This foe is beyond any of you. Run. Behind them, fire glowed in the darkness. A shape loomed, vast, terrible, the Balrog of Morgoth. Its form was shadow, its mane a flame. In its hand a whip of fire, its eyes blazed like coals. Few had seen such a creature and lived. It was a horror from the First Age, a relic of Morgoth's wars, now loose in Middle-earth once more. The Fellowship's flight was desperate. They crossed bridges, leaped chasms, climbed stairways. The heat grew greater, the roar louder. At last they reached the bridge of Khazad-dûm, a narrow span of stone, arching over a vast abyss. On the far side lay escape, but between them and safety, the Balrog advanced. Gandalf turned, staff in one hand, sword in the other. He would not flee. He would stand. And here we pause this part, at the very edge of the abyss. Gandalf, facing shadow and flame. The Fellowship trapped between doom and hope. The fate of their journey hanging in the balance. Rest now, traveler, for in the next telling we will walk the bridge of Khazad-dûm and see the clash of wizard and demon in the dark heart of Moria. The fire grew nearer, the roar of flame, the pounding of footsteps, heavy as stone, falling into stone. The Fellowship had reached the slender bridge, one narrow span, arched across a bottomless abyss. No handrails, no wall, only air and the void below. One misstep and all would be lost. The Balrog advanced. Its body was vast, its form half shadow, half flame. Whips of fire coiled and cracked in its hand. Its eyes burned like coals dug fresh from the furnace of the world's making. Few now lived in Middle-earth who had ever seen such a creature, for the Balrogs had been thought long destroyed, with their master Morgoth at the end of the First Age. Yet here, in Khazad-dûm, one had survived. This was Durin's bane, the terror that had brought Moria to ruin. The orcs, who had pursued so furiously only moments before, now cowered in the shadows, unwilling to follow. Even they, creatures of darkness, feared this fire demon, but the Fellowship could not turn back. There was no escape but forward, across the bridge. And to cross, one must face the terror that barred their way. Gandalf alone stood his ground. He turned to his companions, his voice sharp. "Fly. This foe is beyond any of you. Run." The Fellowship hesitated. Aragorn and Boromir drew their swords, unwilling to leave their friend. But Gandalf's voice rang like iron. "Do as I say. Fly." With reluctance they pulled the hobbits forward. Frodo cried out, his heart torn. But there was no choice. Across the bridge they fled, their footsteps echoing on the stone. Only Gandalf remained. The wizard stood at the center of the bridge, staff in one hand, Glamdring gleaming in the other. The Balrog advanced, fire spilling from its form, shadows spreading wide as wings. The heat rolled across the hall. Smoke choked the air. And then it spoke. Its voice was like a furnace, like rock breaking under pressure, like flame roaring in the deeps of the earth. Words in the black speech, the ancient tongue of Morgoth's servants. Words of power and malice. Gandalf answered, his own voice like thunder echoing in the mountain. The clash of wills was terrible. Light against dark, flame against flame, wizard against demon. For a moment, all Middle-earth seemed to hold its breath. Then Gandalf raised his staff high. His voice rang out across the hall. "You cannot pass." The Balrog strode forward, whip crackling. "I am a servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Anor. You cannot pass. The dark fire will not avail you, flame of Udin. Go back to the shadow. You cannot pass." The demon halted, as though the words themselves were a barrier. But its rage grew greater. With a roar, it stepped onto the bridge. Stone shook beneath its weight. It lifted its sword, a blade of flame. Gandalf met it with Glamdring, white fire against red. The two clashed, sparks flying, thunder echoing. The Balrog pressed forward. The bridge trembled. Gandalf staggered, but did not yield. Again, he lifted his staff. With a cry, he drove it into the stone. Light blazed, power surged. The bridge cracked. A great fissure split beneath the Balrog's feet. The stone fell away, plunging into the abyss. With a roar of fury, the Balrog stumbled. Its body crashed down into the dark, fire trailing behind like a comet, falling into the void. The Fellowship cried out in relief. The demon had fallen. Gandalf had triumphed. But Gandalf did not move. He stood still, leaning on his staff, his face weary. And then, from the depths, the whip of flame lashed upward. It coiled around his legs. The wizard's eyes widened. He cried out not in fear, but in warning. "Fly, you fools!" And then he fell. The Fellowship stood frozen, horror in their eyes. Gandalf was gone. The abyss had swallowed him. For a moment, there was silence. No sound but the fading echoes of the fall. The heart of the Fellowship was broken. Aragorn was the first to move. His voice was urgent, though grief choked him. "Come, We must follow his command. We must get out. Boromir seized Merry and Pippin, pulling them forward. Legolas urged Frodo and Sam. Gimli roared in sorrow, but Aragorn pushed him on. There was no time to grieve. Orcs still lingered in the dark, and the mountain itself seemed alive with malice. They fled through the halls of Khazad-dûm, their footsteps frantic. Behind them, shadows stirred, but none dared pursue. Perhaps even the orcs were stunned by what had occurred. Perhaps they, too, feared the wrath of the fallen demon. At last, after what seemed an eternity, the Fellowship burst into the light. Out of the eastern gate of Moria they came, stumbling into the daylight of Dimril Dale. The sun shone bright, but their hearts were heavy with sorrow. They collapsed upon the grass, gasping for air, their bodies trembling from the flight. But their grief was greater than their weariness. The hobbits wept openly. Gimli bowed his head, beard wet with tears. Even Boromir, proud son of Gondor, looked stricken. Aragorn stood apart, his face grim. He looked upon the mountains, upon the gates of Moria, and his voice was heavy. We must move. We cannot linger here. Orcs may yet come. We must press on to Lothlorien. But the words rang hollow. Without Gandalf, the path ahead seemed dark. The Fellowship had lost more than their guide. They had lost their leader, their wisdom, their hope. Frodo felt the weight of the ring heavier than ever. It lay upon his breast, a burden almost too great to bear, and now without Gandalf, he felt alone. Though his friends surrounded him, he knew the task was his alone to carry. Sam sat beside him, silent. His loyalty was unshaken, but his heart ached for his master's pain. Merry and Pippin clung to one another, too young and too small for such sorrow. Legolas gazed eastward, his elven eyes distant, as though searching for some light that might yet guide them. Gimli muttered prayers to Durin, calling upon the memory of his ancestors to grant him strength. Aragorn at last gave the order. With heavy hearts they rose. Slowly they turned from the mountains and began the long walk, toward the Golden Wood. Each step carried them further from the mines, and from the friend they had lost within. Thus ended the passage through Moria. What had begun as a desperate hope to cross swiftly under the mountains had become tragedy. Gandalf the Grey had fallen. The Fellowship was broken in spirit, though not yet in body. Their quest continued, but the shadow upon their hearts was deep. And so we pause here, traveler. For in our next telling, we will follow the Fellowship into the Golden Wood of Lothlorien. There, among the timeless trees and the gaze of the Lady Galadriel, they will find a measure of rest. And perhaps a glimmer of hope amid the sorrow. The Fellowship walked on in silence. The sun shone bright above the vale of Dimril Dale, but its warmth could not pierce the chill in their hearts. Behind them loomed the dark mouth of Moria, that vast wound in the mountain, a place of ancient glory now consumed by shadow. Gandalf had been swallowed by its depths, and though the path ahead was clear, each step away from Khazad-dûm felt heavier than stone. Aragorn led them eastward. His stride was steady, but grief lined his face. He alone bore the burden of leadership now. The ring-bearer looked to him, the others followed him, yet he felt no triumph in that role. For the cost had been too great. Gandalf was gone, and with him much of their strength and wisdom. The hobbits stumbled on the grassy slopes. Frodo's heart was hollow, as though the ring itself had taken root within him. Its weight pressed upon him more fiercely than ever before, whispering of despair. Sam walked beside him, silent, carrying not only his own sorrow, but his master's as well. Merry and Pippin trudged close, clinging together like lost children, their tears not yet dry. Gimli, son of Gloin, was stricken more deeply than any. For Khazad-dûm was the heart of his people's ancient kingdom, and he had dreamed of beholding its halls in splendor. Instead, he had seen ruin. He had seen Durin's bane. He had seen his greatest hope turned to ash, and his friend Gandalf torn from him in those very halls. His grief was mingled with fury and shame, and though his axe remained at his side, his heart felt broken. Legolas walked lightly, yet even his elven grace seemed dimmed. He had known sorrow before, but this grief was new, to lose one so noble, one so vital to their cause. The elf's eyes looked east, toward the woods that lay beyond, seeking the solace of trees and timeless songs. They reached the Mirror, the still lake that lay beneath the mountains. Its surface was like polished glass, reflecting the sky and the peaks above. Gimli paused there, his heart stirred by memory. He spoke softly, reciting the ancient words of Durin's song. He gazed into the waters, and though none could see what he saw, it is said that Gimli beheld Durin's crown, the reflection of stars upon his brow, shining forever in the depths of Culzerum. For a moment, hope touched his heart. Though Moria was fallen, though Durin's bane walked its halls, the memory of Durin the Deathless remained. The dwarves were not wholly broken. Their spirit yet endured, in song, in stone, in the hearts of their sons. But Aragorn called them onward, for the road was long. They turned east, leaving the Mirror behind, and made their way to the borders of Lothlorien. Lothlorien, the Golden Wood. There time seemed to rest. The air was filled with the scent of Melorn leaves, silver and gold. The light was soft, as though the sun itself bent more gently upon that land. The fellowship entered with weary feet, but as they walked among the trees, a strange peace touched them. It was as though the sorrow of the world were held at bay beyond the borders of that enchanted realm. Elves of the Galadrim appeared among the branches, silent and watchful. Haldir greeted them, his voice calm but firm. At first he was reluctant to allow them passage, for the shadow of Moria clung to them, and the memory of orcs and balrogs lay heavy on the land. Yet when he learned of their quest, and when he looked into the eyes of Frodo and saw the burden he bore, he relented. The fellowship was brought before the Lord and Lady of the Wood, Celeborn and Galadriel. Celeborn spoke first, welcoming them with dignity. But it was Galadriel who held them all in her gaze. Her eyes were ancient, filled with light, yet sorrow too. She saw their grief. She saw their weariness. And without words, she seemed to offer comfort. Galadriel spoke of Gandalf's fall, her voice soft but strong. Do not let your hearts be troubled, for even in the darkness, hope may yet be found. Do not think that all his labors are ended, nor that all is lost. Her words did not erase their grief, but they planted a seed of strength. If Gandalf's story was not wholly done, then perhaps their quest to still bore hope. In Lothlorien, the fellowship found rest. They were given food and drink, lembas bread and clear water from the streams of the Golden Wood. They slept beneath the Malern trees, their dreams filled with the sound of leaves whispering in the wind. For a time, their burdens felt lighter, yet each of them carried sorrow still. Frodo, most of all, found himself drawn to Galadriel. She showed him her mirror, a basin of silver water in which visions might appear. There he saw many things, shadows of possible futures, glimpses of the wide world, and the dangers yet to come. Among them he saw once more the dark mouth of Moria, and in its depths fire burning. The memory of Gandalf's fall returned with piercing pain. Frodo offered her the ring, in a moment of weakness. He asked her to take the burden from him, but Galadriel refused, though temptation burned in her eyes. She passed the test, and her words gave Frodo strength. "I will diminish and go into the west and remain Galadriel." Gimli, too, found healing in Lothlorien. At first, the elf guards looked on him with suspicion, for dwarves and elves had long been at odds. But when Gimli looked upon Galadriel, his heart was filled with reverence. He asked only for a single strand of her hair, to treasure for all his days. And she, moved by his sincerity, granted him 3. Thus, a bond was formed between elf and dwarf. Unlikely but true, Legolas looked upon Gimli with new eyes, and a friendship began to grow. From the ashes of Khazad-dûm's sorrow, something new was born, a hope for healing between their peoples. The days in Lothlorien passed swiftly. At last, the time came for the fellowship to depart. Galadriel gave them gifts, cloaks woven with the magic of her people, light and strong. To Frodo she gave the Phial of Galadriel, a light in dark places, when all other lights go out. To Sam she gave a box of earth from her orchard, blessed to bring forth growth. To Gimli she gave her hair, as he had asked. To Aragorn she gave a sheath for his sword, and the Elfstone, a token of hope. To each she gave words of comfort, though they knew not if they would see her again. As they prepared to leave, Galadriel's voice rose in song. She sang of Gandalf, of his fall into shadow and flame. Her song was both mourning and blessing, both farewell and promise. For though he was lost to them, she hinted at a greater destiny yet unseen. The fellowship wept, but her song lingered in their hearts like a balm. They stepped into their boats upon the Silver Lode, and so their journey continued. Thus the passage through Moria ended not only in sorrow, but in renewal. For though Gandalf had fallen, the fellowship had found new strength in the Golden Wood. They carried with them not only grief, but gifts, friendship, and a light that would not fail. Khazad-dûm remained a place of ruin. Durin's Bane still lurked in its depths. The halls of the dwarfs lay silent, their forges cold. But hope was not wholly lost. Gimli bore in his heart the dream that one day his people might reclaim their ancient home, and Galadriel's gifts, born of Loryn's timeless grace, would carry them through the trials yet to come. The story of Moria was one of greatness and ruin, of shadow and flame, but it was also a story of endurance. For even in the darkest halls, where evil had long dwelt, the memory of light remained. The dwarves had not forgotten, the elves had not forgotten, and neither would we. So, traveler, take these words with you, as you curl up in your chair with your ale or tea. Remember Moria, not only as a place of doom, but as a place of history, of memory, of song. For though shadow may linger long in the deep places of the world, the fire of the dwarves, the courage of the fellowship, and the wisdom of Gandalf endure still. And so our tale closes, not with despair, but with hope. The mines of Moria remain silent, yes, but one day, perhaps, the hammer and anvil will ring again, and in that day, the halls of Durin will shine once more.